The sound of shattering glass cut through the saloon noise. A sharp gasp flew from Emma Sullivan's lips as the tray of drinks slipped on from her fingers. Amber liquor splashed across the old wooden floor of Harlan's place, making every head in the room turn. Emma stood frozen, not even trying to clean the mess. Her eyes were locked on the man who had just stormed through the swinging doors. It was her husband, Thomas Sullivan. Even from across the room, she could see the fury twisting his face. The year was 1877 in Concordia, Kansas, a town that had shot up like a weed after the railroad came through 5 years back. What used to be a dusty trading post was now a real frontier town. It had a general store, a church, a jail, and of course, Harlan's saloon, where Emma had been working for the last 8 months. Harlan, the saloon's beefy owner, barked at her. He had a big mustache and a brow that was always slick with sweat. Clean that up and get back to it. These fellows are not paying to watch you stand there gawking. Emma's hands shook as she bent down to pick up the pieces of broken glass. She could feel Thomas making his way to the bar, shoving past tables of men playing cards and drinking. She kept her head low, knowing that looking him in the eye would only make things worse. A deep voice drawled from a corner table, saying, "Hey, leave her be, Harlan. Accidents happen." Emma risked a quick look to see who had spoken. It was Levy Kincaid, sitting all by himself near the back wall. His hat was pulled down low, but not so low that she could not see his intense eyes fixed on Thomas. Levy was new in town. He had shown up just 3 weeks ago with a small herd of cattle and a big reputation that came with him. Folks said he fought in the war and then made his money driving cattle up from Texas. He was the quiet type, a man who watched more than he talked. Thomas reached the bar and slammed his fist down hard. "I told you to quit this job, Emma," he growled, his voice low so only she, Harlan, and a few others could hear. "No wife of mine is going to be serving drinks to these filthy drifters." Emma kept gathering the broken glass, her hands trembling. "We need the money, Thomas. You keep gambling." Before she could say another word, his boot slammed into her ribs, knocking her to the floor. A sharp intake of breath went through the saloon, but not a single person moved to help. No one except Levy Kincaid. He shot to his feet so fast his chair crashed to the floor behind him. "That is enough," Levy said. His voice cut across the now dead silent room as he walked forward, his boots hitting the floorboards with heavy, deliberate steps. Thomas spun around to size up the man getting in his way. "This is not your business, stranger." "You made it my business when you put your boot to a woman right in front of me," Levy answered back, his hand resting easy, close to the pistol on his hip. "Where I come from, men who hit women are not considered men at all." Emma struggled back to her feet, pressing a hand to the spot on her side where Thomas had kicked her. "Please," she whispered, her eyes flashing between her husband and the cowboy, "do not make it worse." Thomas let out a harsh laugh that had no humor in it. "This is between me and my wife. You best stay out of it if you know what is good for you." Harlan, smelling trouble that could cost him money, finally came out from behind the bar. "Take it outside, gentlemen. I do not want any blood on my floor. Costs too much to clean up." Thomas stared hard at Levy for another long moment, then turned back to Emma. "You be home by sundown or you will regret it," he hissed. Then he stormed out of the saloon, letting the doors swing wild behind him. The saloon stayed quiet for a few moments before the talking started up again. But it was softer now, like everyone was afraid to break the leftover tension. Harlan just grumbled something about foolish family squabbles before going back to his spot behind the bar. Levy knelt down next to Emma, who was still trying to gather the last of the broken glass with shaky hands. "Let me help you with that," he said. He took a handkerchief from his pocket and started carefully wrapping the bigger shards. "Thank you," Emma mumbled, avoiding his eyes. She was painfully aware of the fresh bruise coloring her left cheekbone from what Thomas had done the night before. It was a dark purple-blue mark that no amount of face powder could ever truly hide. "That eye," Levy said in a quiet voice, gentle but firm. "Did he do that too?" Emma did not say a word, and her silence was all the answer he needed. Levy looked at her for a moment, his eyes catching the faded yellow of older bruises on her wrists where her sleeves had slipped up. "Miss Emma," he said, using the name he had heard Harlan call out so many times, "I'm only going to ask you this one time." He paused. "Do you want out?" The question just hung there in the air, so simple but feeling impossibly heavy. Emma's breath hitched in her chest as she finally lifted her head to look him in the eye. Levy's eyes were a deep brown, steady and clear, and they held something she had not seen in a very long time. Respect. I, she started to say, but Harlan cut her off by dropping a broom right beside her. Finish cleaning and get back to your tables, he ordered. Those cowboys from the Miller Ranch just came in, and they are thirsty. Emma took the broom, her gaze falling away from Levy's. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Kincaid, but I can handle my own troubles. Levy got to his feet, and she could not read the look on his face. The offer stands, he said softly. I will be here until sundown if you change your mind. He walked back to his table, and Emma felt a flicker of something inside her. It was a feeling so strange, it took her a moment to even recognize it. It was hope. The afternoon dragged on. Emma moved like a machine, going from table to table, serving drinks and skillfully avoiding the wandering hands of customers. But her mind was a million miles away, playing Levy's words over and over again. Do you want out? It was such a simple question, but the answer felt impossible. Of course she wanted out. She had spent years dreaming of escaping Thomas and his fists. But where could she go? What could she possibly do? A woman all alone on the frontier did not have many choices, and none of them were good. As the afternoon sun started to cast long, golden shadows through the saloon windows, Emma found herself watching the clock with a growing sense of dread. Sundown was coming, and so was Thomas's deadline. She knew without a doubt that he would make her pay if she did not obey him. Levy stayed right there at his table, sipping the same glass of whiskey for hours. He would give a nod to folks who passed by, but mostly he just kept to himself. More than once, Emma looked over and caught him watching her, a thoughtful look on his face. When the clock on the wall struck 5, Emma went up to Harlan at the bar. I need to leave early today, she said as she untied her apron. Harlan scowled at her. Early? This is your busiest time. If you leave now, do not bother coming back tomorrow. Emma froze, her hands gripping the apron tight. This job was the only money she had for herself, even if it was not much. Without it, she would be completely trapped with Thomas. I will cover her wages for today. Levy's voice came from right behind her. He set several coins down on the bar, which was more money than Emma could make in a whole week. Harlan's eyebrows shot up as he quickly scooped up the coins. Well, in that case, Miss Emma, you are free to go. I will see you tomorrow. Emma turned to face Levy, her face a picture of confusion. Why would you do that? Consider it an investment, he answered, in your freedom if you decide you want it. Emma glanced at the swinging doors, then back at the clock. Thomas would be expecting her home any minute. I cannot just leave, she whispered. He will find me. Not where I am thinking of taking you, Levy said, but this has to be your choice, Emma. I am offering you help, not telling you what to do. Emma looked around the saloon at the sticky floors she had scrubbed, at the leering men she had served, and at the tiny back room where she changed her clothes. Then she thought about her home, the little cabin on the edge of town. Every corner of that place held a bad memory. Every night brought a new kind of fear when Thomas would come stumbling in, drunk and looking for someone to blame for his gambling losses. If I go with you, she said, speaking slowly, what happens next? Tonight we ride to my ranch. It is about 20 miles south of here, Levy explained. I have some friends in Colorado. They are good people who can help you get a fresh start somewhere Thomas will never find you. Why? Emma asked, studying his face, looking for any hint that he was lying. Why would you help a complete stranger? A shadow seemed to cross Levy's face. Let's just say I have seen what men like your husband can do when good people do nothing to stop them. I am not making that same mistake again. Emma took a deep, shaky breath, her mind racing. It was crazy to trust this man she hardly knew. But somehow it felt less crazy than going back home to Thomas. She reached up and lightly touched the bruise on her cheek, wincing at the sore spot. I need to get some things from my home, she said at last. Levy shook his head. That is too dangerous. We will buy you whatever you need in the next town. But I have something hidden there, Emma insisted. Something important. Levy thought about it for a second. Is Thomas likely to be home right now? No, Emma answered. He will be at the card game in the back of Peterson's store until it gets dark. All right then, Levy said. We will be quick. Levy gave a firm nod. All right then. Delivery in 15 minutes, and you keep your head down, you hear? Do not talk to a soul on your way. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild mix of fear and newfound hope. 15 minutes, she agreed, then vanished out the saloon's back door into the dusty alley. The streets of Concordia were alive with the usual evening bustle. Shopkeepers were locking their doors, tired workers were heading for home, and mothers were calling their children in for supper. Emma kept her eyes on the boardwalk planks, ducking down side streets to stay out of sight. The Sullivan place was at the end of a dirt lane on the east side of town, a small, rundown shack that had never felt like a home to her. She crept up to it quietly, her eyes scanning for any sign of Thomas's horse. Seeing none, she slipped inside. The cabin was dark and carried the sour smell of old whiskey and dirty laundry. Emma did not hesitate, going right to the loose floorboard under the bed. Her fingers, knowing the task by heart, pried it up, and she pulled out a small cloth sack. Inside was her mother's wedding band, a locket with a curl of her late papa's hair, and the small bit of money she had managed to tuck away over the years. It was not much, but it was enough for a fresh start somewhere far away from here. She was putting the floorboard back when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of an approaching horse. A cold panic washed over her. She peeked through the dirty window and saw Thomas swinging down from his saddle, his steps unsteady from drink even at this hour. Emma looked around the tiny cabin in a frenzy. There was only one door, and Thomas was already stumbling his way toward it. There was no place to hide, no way to run. She clutched the sack to her chest as the door creaked open. Thomas filled the entire doorway, his wide shoulders blocking out the evening light. "Well now," he slurred. "Decided to come on home, did you? Smart girl." Emma backed away from him slowly. "I was just getting changed to start on dinner," she lied, praying he was too drunk to see the pouch clutched in her hand. Thomas stepped inside and shut the door behind him. "That is a funny thing," he said, his voice suddenly calm and dangerous. "I was just talking to Joe Miller. He said he saw you getting awful cozy with that cowboy from the saloon. Said it looked like y'all were making plans." The blood in Emma's veins turned to ice. "Joe Miller is a liar," she said, fighting to keep her voice from shaking. "Mr. King was just being a gentleman." Thomas moved toward her with a speed that was shocking for a drunken man, his hands shooting out and wrapping around her throat. "Are you calling Joe a liar? Or are you the one who is lying, planning to run off with some stranger?" Emma's hands flew up, clawing at his grip as she fought for air. "Thomas, please," she choked out. His other hand found her wrist, squeezing with bone-crushing force until her fingers went numb and she dropped the little sack. It hit the floorboards with a soft thud, its contents scattering. Thomas's eyes narrowed when he saw the money. "You have been hiding money from me," he growled, his grip on her throat tightening. "Been planning this for some time, have you?" Black spots began to dance in front of Emma's eyes as his fingers dug in deeper. This is it, a distant part of her mind thought. After all these years of his heavy hand, this is how it ends. And then, just as suddenly, the pressure was gone. Emma crumpled to the floor, gasping for air, as the sharp crack of splintering wood echoed in the small cabin. Through her tear-filled eyes, she saw Levy Kincaid standing in the doorway, having smashed right through the flimsy latch with his shoulder. Thomas spun around to face the intruder, his hand going for the knife on his belt. "You," he snarled. "I knew it was you." But Levy's revolver was already in his hand. "You step away from her," he commanded, his voice as steady as the gun he was pointing. Thomas paused, his hand still on his knife, weighing his odds. "She is my wife," he spat. "The law is on my side." "The law does not allow for murder," Levy replied, his voice flat. "And that is exactly what you were fixin' to do. Now, I said step back." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Then with a roar, Thomas lunged forward with the knife. The blast from Levy's revolver was deafening inside the small cabin. Thomas staggered back, a look of pure surprise on his face as he looked down at them, dark red blossoms spreading across his shirt. He dropped to his knees and then fell forward onto the floor. Emma could only stare, her hands covering the bruises on her throat. Levy moved to Thomas's side in 2 quick strides, checking for any sign of life. When he found none, he holstered his pistol and turned to Emma. "Are you hurt?" he asked, kneeling down beside her. He Emma could not get the words out, her eyes locked on her husband's still body. Levy gently helped her to her feet. "We have to go now," he said with urgency. "Someone for sure heard that shot." Moving as if in a dream, Emma gathered up her scattered belongings while Levy stood watch at the broken door. "My horse is out back," he told her. "We need to be at my ranch before the sun comes up." "They will come for us," Emma whispered, her voice finally returning. "They will call it murder." "It was self-defense," Levy corrected her firmly. "But you are right, we cannot stay in Concordia. Are you ready?" Emma took one final look at the cabin that had been her prison for 5 long years, at the body of the man who had promised to love and protect her, but had only brought her pain. She straightened her shoulders and gave him a solid nod. "I am ready." They slipped out the back to where Levy's horse, a handsome chestnut gelding, was waiting. Levy helped her onto the saddle before swinging up behind her. As they rode away, Emma could hear shouting in the distance. Someone had indeed heard the gunshot and was now raising the alarm. Levy spurred the horse into a gallop, heading south and away from town. Emma held on tight to the saddle horn, the full weight of what had just happened finally crashing down on her. Thomas was dead, she was free, and she was on the run with a man she hardly knew. "Where are we going?" she shouted over the thunder of the horse's hooves. "To my ranch first," Levy called back. "Then once things have settled down a bit, we will get you on your way to Colorado." The sun was setting, painting the rolling Kansas prairie in shades of orange and gold. Even with the danger they were in, Emma felt a surge of excitement. For the first time in forever, she was riding towards something new, not just surviving another day. "Thank you," she said, turning her head just enough to see him, "for coming back for me." His face was serious in the dimming light. "I gave you my word I would help. I meant it. I just wish it did not have to end in bloodshed." "He would have killed me," Emma said, her voice quiet. "If not today, then someday soon." Levy nodded, his jaw tight. "I know. That is why I followed you instead of waiting at the livery. I had a bad feeling in my gut." They rode on in silence as night fell around them. The only sounds were the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves and the whisper of the wind blowing through the tall prairie grass. Emma was deeply aware of Levy's presence behind her, the solid warmth of his chest against her back and the strength in his arms as he held the reins on either side of her. It had been so long since a man had been this close without bringing her fear and pain. After riding hard for several hours, they came over a rise, and Emma saw the soft glow of lights in the valley below. "Is that your ranch?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Levy confirmed. "Silver Creek Ranch. It is not much to look at yet, but it is all mine." As they got closer, Emma saw a modest but sturdy main house, a large barn, and a few other buildings shown. A bunkhouse stood a little ways off from the main house, with light shining from its windows. They stopped in front of the main house, where Levy swung down and then reached up to help Emma. Her legs felt like jelly after the long ride, and he steadied her with a gentle hand on her elbow. "Easy now," he said. "Let us get you inside to rest." The front door opens before they even reach the porch, and an older woman with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun stood there. She wore a simple dress and had a worried look on her face. "Levy Kincaid," she said, her voice sharp as she took in Emma's bruised face and neck. "What sort of trouble have you brought to my doorstep this time?" "Mrs. Abernathy, this is Emma Sullivan," Levy explained. "She is in need of our help. Emma, this here is Mrs. Abernathy. She runs my house and has been the only mother I've known since I was 12 years old." As Mrs. Abernathy got a better look at Emma, her expression softened right away. "Come on in, honey," she said, moving to the side. "Let's get you cleaned up and put some food in your belly." The inside of the house was plain but felt lived in and warm, with sturdy furniture and clean rugs worn from years of use. A fire was crackling away in the stone fireplace, making the whole room glow. "Mrs. Abernathy, would you mind getting the guest room ready?" Levy asked. "And maybe find us something to eat. We pushed the horses hard and missed supper." "Of course," the older woman answered. "There's stew on the stove, still warm. I'll get some bandages for those bruises on your face, too." While Mrs. Abernathy bustled away, Levy led Emma to a chair near the fire. "Just rest a spell," he told her. "I need to talk to my foreman and set some extra guards tonight, just in case we were followed." Emma just nodded, feeling bone-tired. Will your men be in trouble because of me? Levy's voice was firm. My men can take care of themselves. And they're true to the brand. You don't need to worry about them. After Levy had gone, Emma just stared into the fire. The whole day felt like a terrible dream she could not wake from. Was it really just this morning she was serving whiskey at Harlan's place? Now her husband was gone, she was miles from Concordia, and her life was a blank page all over again. A little while later, Mrs. Abernathy came back with a tray holding a bowl of stew, a basin of warm water, and some clean cloths. Let's see to those bruises, dear, she said, putting the tray down on a small table. Then you need to eat. Emma let the older woman tend to her, flinching just a little when the cloth touched the cut on her cheek. Has Levy ever brought home lost souls like me before? She asked quietly. Mrs. Abernathy gave a small smile. Not the female kind, if that's what you're asking. But yes, he has a habit of picking up folks who are down on their luck. He takes in cowboys who've lost their way, gives a second chance to men that other folks have given up on. He's got a good heart, that boy. Emma had to say it out loud. He took my husband's life today, she said, her voice flat. Mrs. Abernathy's hands stopped moving for just a second. I see, she said. And those marks on your neck, did your husband give those to you? Emma nodded slowly. Well then, it sounds to me like your husband got exactly what he had coming to him, Mrs. Abernathy said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Levy doesn't hurt a soul without a good reason. I've known him since he was a boy, and raising a hand has never been his first move. The door swung open then, bringing in a gust of cold night air, and Levy along with it. Everything's locked down tight, Emma, he said. I put extra men out on the ridge, but I don't reckon anyone followed us. He looked at the tray. Good, you need to get some food in you. Emma picked up the bowl, her stomach suddenly growling with a hunger she had not felt before. While she ate, Levy and Mrs. Abernathy spoke in low voices over by the door. Emma could only catch a few words about the sheriff and waiting a few days, but she was too worn out to make sense of it. After she finished the last of the stew, Mrs. Abernathy led her to a small, neat bedroom at the back of the house. There's a nightgown on the bed for you, she told her. It'll likely be too big, but it's clean. We'll sort you out with some proper clothes tomorrow. Thank you, Emma said, feeling a wave of gratitude wash over her. Thank you for everything. Mrs. Abernathy just patted her hand gently. You get some rest, dear. You're safe here now. Once she was alone, Emma changed into the nightgown, and just as predicted, it was much too big for her. She sat on the edge of the mattress, her fingers tracing the pattern on the handmade quilt. It had been so many years since she had laid in a bed without being afraid, without her whole body tensing at every creak of the floorboards, waiting for Thomas to come home drunk. A soft knock on the door made her jump. Yes, she called out. It's Levy. His voice came through the door. Can I have a word with you for a moment? Emma pulled a shawl that Mrs. Abernathy had left for her around her shoulders and opened the door. Levy was standing in the hall, looking weary but determined. I just wanted to see how you were doing before I turned in, he said, and to tell you what's going to happen next. Emma took a step back, letting him come into the room. He stayed close to the door, giving her plenty of space. I sent one of my men into town to see what he could find out, Levy began to explain. By sunrise, we should know how the law in Concordia is handling Thomas's death. If we have to, I can have you on a train headed for Colorado by tomorrow evening. And what if they come searching for me here? Emma asked, her voice trembling slightly. They won't find you, Levy promised. My men are loyal, and this ranch is a big place. There are spots out here a stranger could never find without a guide. Emma sat down hard on the bed, the weight of it all hitting her at once. Why are you doing all this for me? You could be in a world of trouble. Levy was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something far away. When I was just a boy, he said at last, my father was a man like Thomas. He drank, he gambled away what little we had, and he used his fists on my mother and me whenever he felt like it. One night when I was 12, he came home in a blacker rage than I'd ever seen. He hit my mother so hard she couldn't get back up. He stopped, and Emma could see the muscles in his jaw tighten as he lived it all again. I tried to get in his way, Levy went on, his voice low, but I was just a boy. He tossed me aside like a rag doll. That night he beat her until she was gone, and I had to watch the whole thing completely helpless. The law did nothing. They said a man had a right to discipline his own family however he wanted. I am so sorry, Emma whispered, because now she understood the darkness she had seen in his eyes earlier. I ran away that night, Levy said. I found work on ranches, got bigger, got stronger, and learned how to handle myself. And I made a vow. I promised that if I ever saw a woman in the same spot as my mother, I wouldn't just stand by and let it happen. He looked right at Emma then. So you see, this isn't just about you. This is about a promise I made to myself a long, long time ago. Tears started to well up in Emma's eyes. Not tears of sorrow, but tears from a deep, powerful feeling of connection. Thank you, was all she could say, knowing the words were not nearly enough to express how she felt. Levy just nodded. Get some sleep. We can talk more in the morning. After he was gone, Emma lay in the strange bed, just staring up at the dark ceiling. In spite of the danger, the unknown future, and the shock of it all, she felt a quiet calm she had not known for years. For the first time since the day she was married, she fell asleep without being afraid. The next morning, Emma woke up to sunshine pouring through the window and the faint sounds of a working ranch. Men were calling out to one another, horses were nickering, and there was a steady clang of a hammer on steel that she figured was a blacksmith at his forge. For a second, she did not know where she was, but then everything from the day before came rushing back. She got dressed in the same clothes from yesterday, wishing for something fresh, but feeling thankful for what she had. When she walked out of the bedroom, she found Mrs. Abernathy in the kitchen, her hands covered in flour as she kneaded dough on a big wooden table. Good morning, dear, the older woman said with a warm smile. Did you sleep all right? Better than I have in years, Emma confessed. Where is Mr. Kincaid? Levy rode out before the sun came up to meet the man he sent to town, Mrs. Abernathy explained. He ought to be back any minute. In the meantime, let's get you some breakfast. Emma sat down at the kitchen table and watched as Mrs. Abernathy moved around with practiced ease, cooking up eggs, bacon, and biscuits that were fresh from the oven. There was something so calming about the simple, everyday scene, a world away from the tense, quiet mornings she used to have. Mrs. Abernathy, Emma started, a little hesitant. Can I ask how long you've been working for Mr. Kincaid? Going on 8 years now, the housekeeper said, placing a full plate in front of Emma. I met him back in Wichita when he was just getting his start. He'd bought his first little herd and needed a cook for his crew. My husband had passed, and I surely needed the work. I've been with him ever since. It seems like he earns a person's loyalty, Emma noted, thinking about what Levy had said about his men. Mrs. Abernathy nodded. That he does. He treats his people fair, works right alongside them instead of just barking orders. And he's got a sharp mind for business. He built this entire ranch up from scratch in just a handful of years. They were cut short by the sound of horses riding up to the house. Mrs. Abernathy went to the window to look. That'll be Levy now, she said, and it looks like Jake is with him. He's the one who went to town. A few moments later, Levy walked into the kitchen, taking off his hat as he crossed the threshold. His face was set in a hard line. Morning, Emma, he said. I see Mrs. Abernathy is taking good care of you. What's the word? The housekeeper asked, getting straight to the point. Levy raked a handy through his hair. It's not good. Sheriff Jenkins put a posse together. They're calling it murder, not a case of self-defense. Seems some of Thomas's card-playing buddies are telling folks he was just talking about how Emma was planning to run off with another man. Said he was just going home to talk to her, not to hurt her. Emma felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. But that is not how it happened. He had his hands around my throat when you got there. I believe you, Levy said, his voice steady. But right now, it is your word against theirs. And Thomas had plenty of friends in that town. Men who owed him or were just plain scared of him. Besides, Sheriff Jenkins has never had much use for me. What are we going to do? Emma asked, the fear she had pushed away starting to creep back in. We're sticking with the plan, Levy said firmly. Tonight, Jake will take you to Salinas. There is a train bound for Denver that leaves at midnight, Levy told her. I have already made arrangements for a family there to help you until you can get settled. And what about you? Emma asked, her voice laced with worry. She saw that he had not included himself in this plan. I will stay right here, Levy answered her. If the sheriff decides to come around asking questions, I will be the one to handle him. Emma immediately shook her head. No, No, I cannot let you face any trouble for helping me. I am the one who should turn myself in and tell them the truth of what happened. And you truly think they will believe you? Levy asked her, his tone gentle. They will see a woman who, according to her husband's friends, has a history of making up wild stories. No, Emma, the best thing you can do is get clear of Kansas. Find somewhere new and start over. And I do not want to hear another argument, Levy said, cutting her off. Mrs. Abernathy, would you mind finding some proper traveling clothes for Emma? And maybe help her pack some food for the long trip? The housekeeper gave a firm nod. You come with me, dear, she said warmly to Emma. I believe I have exactly what you are going to need. Emma reluctantly let Mrs. Abernathy lead her out of the kitchen. She looked back over her shoulder at Levy, who had slumped into a chair with a heavy look on his face. She could not stand the idea of him getting into legal trouble, or something even worse, all because of her. There just had to be another way. Mrs. Abernathy took her to a small room just off the main hall that she used for sewing and storing things. Levy's sister left a few dresses here the last time she came to visit, she said as she opened up a large trunk. I reckon she is about your size. I did not even know he had a sister, Emma said, truly surprised. A half-sister, to be exact. They have different mothers. Mrs. Abernathy lifted out a sensible dress made of dark blue wool, perfect for a journey. This ought to do just fine, and there is a cloak in here that will keep you good and warm on that train. While they looked through the clothes, Emma's thoughts were racing. Mrs. Abernathy, she finally began, does Levy always put everyone else before himself like this? The older woman gave her a sad smile. Always. That is just his way. And sometimes it gets him into trouble. He takes on the burdens of other folks like they are his own. But this is my burden to carry, Emma insisted. My husband, my problems. I cannot let him sacrifice everything for me. Mrs. Abernathy looked at her for a long moment. You have already started to care for him, have you not? Emma's face grew warm. I am very grateful to him, of course. He saved my life, Bus. I see more than just gratitude in your eyes, child, Mrs. Abernathy said softly. And I cannot say that I blame you. Levy is a good man, the kind you do not find too often in these parts. Emma did not try to deny it. How could she? In the short time she had known Levy King, he had shown her more kindness than her husband Thomas had in 5 long years of marriage. But any feeling that went beyond thankfulness felt wrong, impossible. Her husband was just barely gone, and she was a woman on the run. It does not make a difference, she said at last. By tonight, I will be long gone. Perhaps, Mrs. Abernathy replied in a mysterious way, or perhaps there is another path to take. Before Emma could ask her what she meant, a loud noise from outside interrupted them. It was the sound of several horses riding up to the house at a full gallop. Mrs. Abernathy rushed over to the window, and all the color drained from her face. It is the sheriff, she whispered, and he has brought at least 6 men with him. Emma's heart started pounding in her chest. They had found her already. Quickly, Mrs. Abernathy urged, grabbing the blue dress and a few other things. Go out the back and head straight for the root cellar. It is behind the kitchen garden. You stay hidden there until I send someone to get you. With hands that would not stop shaking, Emma changed into the blue dress and pushed her old clothes into a sack Mrs. Abernathy handed her. She clutched the bag tightly and slipped out the back of the house just as a loud banging started on the front door. The root cellar was not hard to spot. It was a small hill of earth with a wooden door about 50 yards from the house. Emma swung the door open, climbed down into the cool darkness, and pulled it shut behind her. The cellar smelled of dirt and potatoes with a damp chill in the air. She found a wooden crate to sit on and listened hard for any sound from outside. But the thick walls of earth blocked everything out. Time crawled by so slowly. Emma could only sit and imagine all the terrible things that might be happening in the house. She pictured Levy being arrested, the sheriff and his men tearing the place apart, and then finally discovering her. After what felt like hours but was probably less than one, the cellar door creaked open. Emma scrambled back into the darkest corner she could find, but it was only Jake, one of Levy's ranch hands, looking down at her. Miss Emma, Mr. King sent me to come get you. It is all clear now. Emma cautiously climbed out of the cellar, blinking against the bright afternoon sun. "The sheriff is gone," Jake told her. "But Mr. King needs to talk to you right away. He is waiting for you in the barn." Emma followed Jake across the yard to the big barn. Inside, she found Levy putting a saddle on a horse. It was not the same chestnut one from the day before, but a strong-looking gray mare. "Emma," he said as soon as he saw her. "Good, you are here. There has been a change of plans." "I heard the sheriff," Emma said, her voice unsteady. "Did they come looking for me?" "For both of us," Levy said, his face grim. "They claim to have witnesses who say I threatened Thomas earlier in the day. They are saying we plan to murder him together." Emma let out a sharp gasp. "But that is not true." "Of course it is not," Levy agreed. "But the truth does not always count for much in a situation like this. Sheriff Jenkins has been looking for a reason to cause me trouble. I have been a thorn in his side ever since I got here, refusing to pay the fees he demands for protection and calling him out for being corrupt. Now he figures he has got me cornered." "What did you tell him?" Emma asked. "I told him I had not seen you since yesterday afternoon down at the saloon," Levy answered, "that I had no idea where you could be. He did not believe me, of course, and he insisted on searching the house. Mrs. Abernathy got you out of there just in the nick of time." "So what do we do now?" Emma asked. She noticed Levy was getting 2 horses ready, not just one. "Now we both have to get out of here," Levy said, pulling a cinch tight. "Jenkins swore he would be back with a warrant for my arrest by morning. He is only gone because he needs to round up more men. He knows my ranch hands will not just stand by and let him take me." A wave of guilt washed over Emma. "This is all my fault." Levy stopped what he was doing and looked straight at her. "No, Emma. This is the fault of men like Thomas, who think they can own their wives. This is the fault of crooked lawmen like Jenkins, who use their badge for their own gain. Do not you dare take on the blame for this." His words were like a warm blanket, even as the weight of their dangerous situation settled over her. "So we are both fugitives now." "Yes," Levy confirmed. "I have spent the last hour getting things in order. Jake will look after the ranch while I am gone. He has been my foreman for years, and he knows this place as well as I do. Mrs. Abernathy is going to tell everyone that I had to go to Topeka on business. That should give us a head start of a few days." "Where will we go?" Emma asked. "I have a friend who has a homestead deep in the Colorado territories," Levy explained. "It is way out there, hard to find if you do not know the trail. We can lay low there until this all blows over, and then figure out what to do next." Emma slowly nodded her head. "When do we leave?" "Right now," Levy said. "The sheriff took the main road back to town, so we are heading west, straight across the country. We will have to ride hard and stay clear of any towns." Jake came back carrying saddlebags filled with supplies, and he tied them onto the horses. "Everything is all set, boss," he said. "There is enough food for a week, plus blankets and ammunition. And Mrs. Abernathy packed a few personal things for Miss Emma." "Thank you, Jake," Levy said, shaking the man's hand. "You take care of this place. I will send word as soon as I can." "Do not you worry about a thing here," Jake promised him. "You just get yourselves to Colorado safely." Levy helped Emma onto the gray mare, and she settled into the saddle. It had been years since she had last been on a horse, but the feeling came back to her like it was yesterday. Levy swung himself up onto his own horse, a powerful black stallion. "Stay close to me," he told her. "If we get split up for any reason, just head west, toward the setting sun. I will find you." And with that, they rode out of the barn and across the ranch yard. A few of the cowboys paused their work to watch them go, raising their hands in a quiet farewell. As they reached the edge of the property, Emma turned back for one final look at the Silver Creek Ranch. It had been her sanctuary for such a short time, and now she was leaving it behind. "I'm so sorry about your ranch," she said as they rode beside each other across the wide open prairie. Levy's face was set with determination, not regret. "It is just a place," he said. "I built it from nothing once before. I can do it again if I have to. Some things are more important." The way he looked over at her when he said that made Emma's heart jump in a way she had not felt in a very, very long time. She tried to tell herself it was just the thrill of the escape, the danger of it all, but deep down she knew it was something else entirely, something she was not quite ready to put a name to. They pushed the horses hard all through the day, only stopping for a few moments to let them drink and catch their breath. Levy kept them far from any roads or towns, leading them across the vast prairie like a man who knew the land by heart. When the sun started to dip low, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Levy guided them into a small grove of trees next to a creek. "We will make camp here for the night," he announced. "The horses need a good rest, and so do we." Emma slid down from her horse, her legs feeling stiff and sore from the long hours of riding. They wasted no time making camp. Levy gathered wood for a small, sheltered fire, laid out their bedrolls, and saw to the horses. Emma helped wherever she was able, thankful to have something to do to keep her mind off her troubles. As they sat by the fire, eating a simple supper of jerky, bread, and dried fruit, Emma watched Levy's face in the flickering light. The last 2 days had thrown them together under some mighty strange circumstances. She realized she barely knew the man, other than the little he had told her about his childhood. "Tell me about your ranch," she said softly. "What made you decide to settle down in Kansas?" Levy took a long drink from his canteen before he spoke. "Well, after the war, I was adrift for a spell. Worked some cattle drives up from Texas, saving every penny I made. When the railroad started pushing through Kansas, I saw my chance. Land was cheap, and that railroad meant I could get my cattle to markets back east. I bought a few hundred acres and a small herd to get started. I built a house myself with my own 2 hands." "It's a beautiful place," Emma said. "You've built so much." Levy just shrugged. "It is not so much about having it. It is about the building of it, the satisfaction you get from making something out of nothing." He looked over at her, his eyes curious. "What about you? How did you find your way to Concordia?" Emma sighed, poking at the fire with his dick. "I came out west with my folks when I was 16. My father was a school teacher, and he truly believed this frontier was the future. He and my mother both took a fever that second winter and passed on. I was all alone, just 18 years old, with no real skills to speak of, other than what they had taught me." She paused for a moment, the memories feeling both sharp and a lifetime away. "Thomas was the son of the richest merchant in town. He came courting, and he seemed like a kind and steady man. Marrying him just felt like the smart thing to do. It was not until after we were married that I found out who he really was." "The drinking?" Levy asked gently. Emma nodded. "And the gambling, and a temper that always seemed to find me." She rubbed her arms without thinking. 5 years of walking on eggshells, just never knowing what might set him off. "You made it through," Levy said, and his voice was full of respect, not pity. "That takes a strong person." "Surviving is not strength," Emma replied quietly. "It is just not dying." "No," Levy disagreed, his voice firm. "Plenty of folks would have broken under a lighter load. You endured. You kept your spirit from shattering. That is strength, Emma." His words reached a place deep inside her, a part of herself she thought she had lost for good. Before she could find an answer, Levy stood up and tossed more wood on the fire. "You ought to get some sleep," he said. "I will take the first watch." "You need your rest too," Emma protested. "Wake me in a few hours and I will take my turn." A small smile touched Levy's lips. "All right, but get some sleep now." Emma settled down on her bedroll, pulling the blanket tight against the cooling night air. As she drifted off, she could see Levy sitting not far off, his shape a dark outline against the starry sky. He looked solid, watchful, and safe. For the first time in years, she fell asleep without any fear creeping into her dreams. The next morning came up clear and cool, with dew sparkling on the prairie grass. Emma awoke to find Levy already had a small fire going and was brewing coffee. "Did you get any sleep at all?" she asked, seeing the tired lines under his eyes. "Enough," he answered, handing her a tin cup full of hot coffee. "We should make the Colorado border by nightfall if we can keep a good pace." They packed up their camp quickly and pointed their horses west once more. The land started to change as they rode, the flat prairie slowly turning into rolling hills with small stands of trees here and there. Levy kept them moving at a steady gait, his eyes always scanning for any sign of pursuit or even other travelers. Around noon, they stopped on the crest of a hill and looked back over the wide open space they had just crossed. Far off in the distance, Emma thought she could just make out a group of riders, but it was too far to be sure. "Levy," she said, pointing, Do you think that could be the sheriff's posse? Levy squinted, shielding his eyes as he stared at the horizon. Could be, or it might just be a hunting party, or some cowboys moving cattle. Either way, we will just keep moving and keep our eyes open. As they rode on, Levy guided them into rougher country, following animal trails and dry creek beds that would make them harder to track. Emma was amazed by how well he knew this land, how he could find a way through places that looked impossible. How do you know this part of the country so well? She asked while they worked their way down a narrow ravine. I drove cattle through here for years, Levy explained. You learn to read the land, or you lose your herd and every dime you have. Besides, I have always had a pretty good sense of direction. It comes in mighty handy out here where there is not much to steer by. By late afternoon, dark clouds started to pile up on the horizon. The wind picked up, and it carried the smell of rain. Levy looked up at the sky with a frown. A storm is brewing. We had best find some shelter before it breaks. They rode faster now, searching the landscape for any place to get out of the weather. Finally, Levy spotted a rock outcropping with a shallow cave carved underneath it. There, he said, pointing. It is not much, but it ought to keep us dry. They made it to the cave just as the first big drops of rain began to fall. It was a small space, but it was dry and had enough room for them and their essential gear. The horses would have to ride out the storm outside, but Levy tied them securely in a sheltered spot right up against the rocks. Inside the little cave, Emma and Levy sat next to each other and watched the storm get worse. Lightning lit up the sky, followed by deep rolls of thunder that felt like they were shaking the ground itself. The rain came down in solid sheets, turning the earth outside into mud in just a few minutes. Well, at least the rain will wash out our tracks, Levy said. Emma nodded, pulling her cloak tighter around herself as a cold wind blew into their shelter. How much farther is it to your friend's homestead? Another day's ride, Levy answered. Maybe a little more, depending on how bad this storm chews up the trail. We are in Colorado now, though. Just barely. They fell quiet for a while, just listening to the storm rage outside. Even with the wild weather, Emma felt a strange kind of calm. Here in this tiny cave, with Levy right beside her, she felt safer than she ever had inside the walls of her own house. Tell me about your friend in Colorado, Emma said. She wanted to distract herself from how close they were sitting, but she was also truly curious. Ethan Miller, Levy said. We fought in the war together. We pulled each other out of the fire more times than I can recall. He came out west after had set up a homestead in the mountains, carving out a good life for him and his wife Martha. They have got 3 kids now. Do you think they will mind taking in folks on the run? Emma asked, her voice tight with worry. A small smile touched Levy's lips. Ethan owes me a favor or two, and they are good people. They are the kind who judge a person by what they see with their own eyes, not by gossip or accusations. I sure hope they like what they see in me, Emma said in a quiet voice. Levy turned his head to look at her, his face serious. They will, he said, with a calm certainty. I do. That simple admission hung in the space between them, heavy with things left unsaid. Emma felt a warmth creep up her neck and was thankful for the dim light inside their small shelter. Outside, the storm was still howling, but inside, a whole different kind of storm was brewing, one that had nothing to do with the wind and rain and everything to do with the connection growing between them. Levy, Emma started, not sure how to ask. When this is all over, when we are finally safe, what happens after that? He was quiet for a long moment, thinking it over. That depends on a lot of things, he finally answered. It depends on if the law in Kansas is still after us, and on what you want for your own future. And what about you? Emma asked, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the sound of the rain. Levy's eyes, deep and thoughtful, met hers. I want the same thing I have always wanted, a quiet life, a hard day's work, maybe a family of my own someday. But more than anything, I just want to be a good man, the kind who keeps his word and helps folks who need it. You are that man, Emma said, her voice full of belief. The very best I have ever known. Something in Levy's face changed then, a softening around his eyes. Flicker of vulnerability she had not seen before. He moved slowly, giving her plenty of time to back away, and reached out to touch her cheek. His fingers were calloused from years of working cattle, but his touch was unbelievably gentle as he traced the edge of the fading bruise near her eye. No woman should ever have to wear a mark like this, he said, his voice thick with emotion, especially not one as brave and as good as you are. Emma found herself leaning into his hand, closing her eyes for just a second. When she opened them again, Levy was watching her with a look so intense it stole her breath. I know this is happening too fast, he said quietly. Your husband is hardly in the ground and we are running for our lives. But I have to tell you, no matter what happens, no matter where we end up, I will be there for you. Not as some hero or protector, but as a man who sees you for who you are and respects the choices you make. Tears started to well up in Emma's eyes. His words were so different from the way Thomas used to talk, with all his demands for her to obey him. Levy was offering her something she had never been given before, for a true partner, respect, and a choice. Thank you, she whispered, placing her hand over his, right where it rested on her cheek. Just then, a huge crack of thunder exploded outside, making them both jump. Levy pulled his hand back, though it seemed like he did not want to, and turned his attention back to the storm. It is getting worse out there, he noted. We could be stuck here for a while. Emma nodded, already missing the warmth of his hand on her skin. At least we are dry, she said, trying to sound practical, even though her heart was pounding. As the night went on, the storm did not let up one bit. They ate a simple meal from their supplies, not saying much, but they were both very aware of each other in that small enclosed space. When it was time to sleep, Levy made sure Emma took the driest spot deep in the cave, while he sat himself down near the entrance. I will keep watch, he told her. You try and get some sleep. Emma lay down on her bedroll, but sleep would not come. Her mind was racing with thoughts of the danger they were in, the unknown road ahead, and most of all the man sitting just a few feet from her. In the short time she had known Levy Kincaid, he had come to mean more to her than she ever thought possible. The thought was both wonderful and frightening all at once. The morning sun finally broke through the clouds, but the sky still looked heavy and gray. They stepped out of their shelter to find the landscape was completely changed. Streams were spilling over their banks, and the ground was soft and slick with mud. This is going to slow us down, Levy said, looking at the trail ahead, and it will be hard going for the horses. But they set out anyway, picking their way carefully through the soaked land. The travel was much slower than the day before. They had to keep making wide turns to get around washed-out gullies and deep patches of mud. By midday, they had not even covered half the ground Levy had been hoping for. The sky turned dark again, and a fine, cold rain started to fall. Emma pulled her cloak tighter, trying to keep from shivering where he could see. But Levy noticed. All right, we need to find better shelter, he said, and his voice was full of concern. You will catch your death out in this. I am fine, Emma insisted, because she did not want to be the reason for another delay. Levy gave her a look that said he did not believe her, but he did not argue. Instead, he turned them toward a line of hills they could just see in the distance. There is an old trapper's cabin up in those hills, if my memory serves me right. It is not much, but it will be a sight better than another night in a cave. The rain got heavier as they rode, changing from a drizzle into a cold, steady downpour. By the time they finally reached the hills, they were both soaked clean through, even with their cloaks. Levy's memory turned out to be right on the money. Tucked into a small clearing was a rough-looking cabin. The roof was sagging a bit, but it looked whole. You wait here, Levy said as he swung down from his horse. He walked toward the cabin slowly, his hand resting on his revolver. After a quick look inside, he waved for Emma to come ahead. It is empty. Looks like no one has used it for a good long while. The inside of the cabin was dusty and bare. There was a rough-hewn table with one chair, a simple bed frame without a mattress, and a stone fireplace that looked like it would still draw. It was not much at all, but to Emma, who was cold and dripping wet, it looked like a palace. Levy got right to work building a fire while Emma took care of the horses, leading them under the cover of a lean-to that was built into the side of the cabin. By the time she came back inside, Levy had a small fire crackling, and its warm glow filled the little room. Get out of those wet clothes, he said in a matter-of-fact way, turning his back to give her some privacy. Wrap yourself in a blanket and get near the fire. I will do the same once you are situated. Emma did what he said, feeling thankful for the warmth of the wool blanket and the fire. After Levy had also changed, they sat side by side in front of the flames with their wet clothes spread out nearby to dry. How far are we now from your friend's homestead? Emma asked. If this weather clears up, we could be there by tomorrow afternoon, Levy answered. But if this rain starts up again, it could take us longer. The passes up in the mountains will be mighty tricky. Emma nodded, fighting back a shiver that had nothing to do with being cold. Do you think the sheriff is still after us? Most likely, Levy said, his voice grim. Jenkins is a stubborn man, and now his pride is on the line. But this storm will slow him down just like it did us, and we have the advantage because we know where we are headed. They sat in silence for a while, just watching the flames dance and flicker in the hearth. Emma was completely aware of Levy sitting next to her, of the blanket draped over his wide shoulders, and the way the firelight cast shadows on the strong lines of his face. Levy, she said all of a sudden, needing to say the words that had been weighing on her. What if I have ruined your life? Your ranch, your home, everything you have worked so hard for is in danger because of me. Levy turned to look at her, his expression completely serious. Emma, you listen to me. You have not ruined a single thing. I knew what I was doing when I made my choice. If I had the chance to do it all over again, I would not change my mind. But, no buts, he cut in gently. Some things are more important than land or what people think of you. A man who is not willing to stand up for what is right is not much of a man at all. His words stopped her. Protests, but she still felt the weight of her guilt. He must have seen it on her face because he reached over and took her hand. Emma, look at me, he said, and he waited until her eyes met his. I do not regret helping you. Not for 1 second. Whatever comes next, we are going to face it together, all right? The conviction in his voice, the steady look in his eyes, and the warmth of his hand holding hers all came together to give her a feeling of safety she thought she had lost forever. She gave a slow nod. All right, Levy smiled, and the expression changed his whole face, making him look younger and wiping away some of the worry lines. Good. Now we should both try to get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. Even though the cabin was rough, Emma slept better than she had in ages, comforted by the sound of the rain on the roof and the knowledge that Levy was close by, keeping watch. When she woke up, sunlight was pouring through the cabin's one small window, and the sound of birds had taken the place of the rain. Levy was already awake, fixing a simple breakfast from what was left of their supplies. Morning, he said to her. Weather has cleared up. We should make good time today. They ate quickly, both of them anxious to get moving. Their clothes had dried by the fire, and even though they were a little stiff, they were good enough for the journey ahead. The land grew steeper and more rugged as they rode, with tall pine forests slowly replacing the wide-open prairie. The mountain air felt different up here, clean and sharp with the smell of pine trees. Even with all the trouble that brought them this far, Emma could not help but admire the rugged land all around them. It sure is pretty, she said, as they let the horses drink from a clear mountain creek. Levy nodded, filling up their canteens. Whole lot different than Kansas, he agreed. Colorado has its own kind of rough beauty, I reckon. It is harsher in some ways, but it will take your breath away in others. Emma heard herself ask before she could even think about it. Could you be happy living here? If you could never go back to Kansas? Levy took his time, thinking on the question for real. I suppose I could be happy anywhere I can build something that matters, he said after a moment. He looked over at her real quick before going back to his work. It is not the place so much as what you do with it, and who you are doing it with. That simple thought made Emma's heart do a little flip. She told herself it was too soon to be having feelings like that. It was too soon after Thomas, and they had not known each other that long. Still they pushed on, riding higher and higher into the mountains. The path got so narrow they had to ride in a single line with Levy up front. Around noon, he pulled his horse to a dead stop and threw up a hand for Emma to halt. What is it? She whispered, seeing how tight he was holding himself. Riders, Levy said in a low voice, coming up the trail right behind us. Emma's heart started pounding in her chest. Cannot be sure if it is the sheriff from this far out, Levy said, and his voice was all business. But we are not taking any chances. There is a fork up ahead. We will take the path folks use less and try to shake them. They nudged their horses on, moving as fast as the rocky ground would let them. When they reached the split in the trail, Levy guided them onto a skinny path that went straight up the side of the mountain. It was a tough climb, and it took every bit of their focus just to stay safe. After a solid hour of hard riding, they stopped in a little clearing to let the horses catch their breath. Levy hopped off and walked to a spot where he could get a good look back down the trail. "I do not see a soul," he told her, "but that does not mean they are not still coming. We need to keep on moving." Emma just nodded, too worn out to say a word. The long journey, the constant worry of getting caught, and the storm of feelings from the last few days were all starting to wear her down. But she pulled her shoulders back and got back on her horse without a single complaint. She was not going to be the one to slow them down. The afternoon dragged on as they climbed even higher. The air got thinner, making it hard for them and the horses to breathe. At last, just as the sun was starting to drop behind the mountains, Levy pointed up ahead. A little curl of smoke was rising from a clearing in the trees. "That is Ethan's place," he said, and you could hear the relief clear in his voice. "We made it." They rode on into the clearing and saw a sturdy log cabin, much bigger and better built than the little shack they had stayed in the night before. A barn was close by, along with a few other small buildings. Rows of crops were planted out behind the cabin, and a little orchard of fruit trees grew off to one side. As they got closer, the cabin door swung open. A tall man with a beard that was starting to go gray stepped out, holding a rifle. He squinted at them for a long second before his face lit up. "Well, I will be. Levy Kincaid," he called out, lowering the gun. "What in the world brings you all the way up my mountain?" "Trouble, Ethan," Levy answered, plain and simple, as they rode into the yard. "The kind of trouble I was hoping you could help us with." Ethan Miller's face turned serious as he took in their dusty clothes and the bone-tired look in their eyes. "Well, get on inside," he said. "Martha is just about to put supper on. Whatever mess you are in, it can wait until you have got a hot meal in you." The inside of the cabin was warm and welcoming. There was furniture made by hand, bright quilts, and the wonderful smell of food cooking. A woman who had to be Martha was busy at the stove, while 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, sat at the table. "Martha, look who the mountain blew in," Ethan announced. "Levy Kincaid." He stopped for a second, looking over at Emma with a questioning eye. "This is Emma Sullivan," Levy said, "a friend who needs a little help." Martha Miller dried her hands on her apron and walked over to welcome them. She was a solid woman with kind eyes and a way about her that said she did not put up with any nonsense. "Any friend of Levy's is a friend of ours," she said. "You two look like you are half-starved and about to fall over. Sit yourselves down and eat. Then you can tell us what brings you clear out here from Kansas." The meal they ate was the best thing Emma could remember tasting in years. They had roasted deer meat, potatoes, fresh baked bread, and apple pie for dessert. The Miller children were shy at first, but soon they were asking all sorts of questions about the trip. Levy told them stories, but he was careful to leave out all the dangerous parts and make it sound like a grand adventure. After dinner, once the children were sent off to bed over their protests, the grown-ups sat together around the fire. Levy told them everything that had happened over the last few days. He told them about Thomas and his mean streak, the fight at the cabin, and the sheriff chasing after them. He told the story straight, without making himself sound better or making excuses for what he did. When he was finished, Ethan sat there quiet for a good long while, just puffing on his pipe and thinking. "So you took care of a man who was choking his own wife," he finally said, summing it all up. "And now the law aims to hang you for doing it." "That is about the size of it," Levy said. Ethan looked over at Martha, and it was like they had a whole conversation without saying a word. "Well," Ethan said, "the law does not have a very long reach up in these mountains. Y'all are welcome to stay here as long as you need." "We would not want to bring our trouble to your doorstep," Emma said, feeling she had to protest. Martha just let out a little snort. "Trouble, child, we built this place with our own 2 hands out of nothing but wilderness. We have stood up to Indians, blizzards, bears, and men trying to steal our claim. A crooked sheriff from Kansas does not scare us one bit." "Still," Levy said, "we ought not to stay too long. If that Sheriff Jenkins is stubborn enough to follow us this far, he might just find this place sooner or later." "He would have to know where he was looking first," Ethan pointed out. "And even if he did, for every one trail that leads somewhere up here, there are a dozen that lead to nowhere. You are safe here, for now anyway." The talk then turned to other things, like where Emma and Levy would sleep, which was in a little guest cabin nearby. They talked about all the chores that needed doing around the homestead, and Ethan was quick to say there were plenty. Later on, as Emma lay in the small but cozy bed in the guest cabin, she felt a quiet settle over her that she had not felt since they ran from Concordia. They were safe, at least for a little while. They had a roof over their heads, food in their bellies, and friends who would stand between them and danger. Most importantly, they had time to breathe, to think, and to figure out what was next. As sleep finally came for her, Emma realized something startling. For the first time since Thomas died, she was looking toward tomorrow with a glimmer of hope. The next morning, bright sunlight poured through the cabin window, waking Emma along with the sound of men's voices outside. She quickly put on the clothes Martha had loaned her, a plain dress that was a little big but spotless and solid, and stepped into the crisp air. She found Levy and Ethan splitting firewood over by the barn. Levy's head snapped up when he saw her, and a wide smile spread across his face, sending a surprising jolt of warmth through here. "Mornin'," he called out. "Sleep all right?" "Better than I have in days," Emma answered, and she meant it. "Where is Martha? I ought to help with breakfast." "Already handled," Ethan said with a grin. "Martha's been up since before the sun, but I am sure she would appreciate a hand with the other chores." Emma nodded and walked toward the main house. Inside, she found Martha at the table, kneading a big ball of dough while her children finished their breakfast. "Good morning," Martha said without looking up. "Help yourself to some food. There is coffee on the stove and biscuits in the warming oven." "Thank you," Emma said, pulling out a chair. "And thank you for taking us in. This is far more kindness than we had any right to expect." Martha's strong hands kept working the dough as she spoke. "Levy Kincaid is kin, and it does not matter if we share our blood or not. Any woman escaping a man who uses his fists will always find a place at my table." The simple, straightforward way she said it brought tears to Emma's eyes. Martha saw them and pulled a clean cloth from her apron pocket, handing it over. "Now none of that," she said, her voice firm, but her eyes gentle. "You are safe here, and that is the end of that story. Now eat your breakfast. Then you can give me a hand with the laundry." The day went by in a flurry of simple chores that Emma found deeply comforting after the fear and uncertainty of their journey. She helped Martha with the washing, the baking, and weeding the small kitchen garden. Meanwhile, Levy worked with Ethan, patching up the barn roof and tackling other jobs around the property. That evening, they all gathered around the dinner table again. The conversation was easier this time, filled with stories and even some laughter. Emma found her eyes drifting to Levy, noticing the way the corners of his eyes crinkled when he smiled. She watched how he truly listened when someone else was talking and saw the kindness he showed the Miller children. He was nothing like Thomas, whose charm was always a thin cover for his cruelty and whose attention was always centered on himself. With every passing hour, Emma felt more sure that her gut feeling about Levy had been right. He was a good man, maybe the very best man she had ever known. The days melted into a week, and a comfortable rhythm took hold. Emma and Levy worked right alongside the Millers, earning their keep and finding a quiet satisfaction in a hard day's work. In the evenings, they often took a walk around the property, their conversations starting with small things but slowly moving into deeper waters. On one of those evenings, as they stood watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of gold and rose, Levy turned to her. He seemed to be searching for his words. "Emma," he started, "I have been doing a lot of thinking about what comes next for us." "Me too," she admitted softly. "We cannot stay here forever," Levy went on. "Ethan and Martha have been a blessing, but this is not our home. Sooner or later, we have to decide if we keep running or if we turn back and face what is waiting for us in Kansas." Emma nodded, her gaze fixed on the faraway peaks. "I've been thinking on that too, wondering if there might be some way to clear your name. Mine does not matter as much. Thomas is gone, and I have no family left to bring shame to. But you had a life there, a ranch, and folks who counted on you." Levy was silent for a long moment. "That ranch means something to me," he finally said. "I will not pretend it does not. But if the choice is between that piece of land and doing the right thing, well, that is no choice at all." He turned to face her, taking both of her hands in his. "Emma, there is something I have to say. I hope you will not think it is too soon, or that I am trying to take advantage of the situation we are in." Emma's heart started to pound in her chest as she looked into his eyes. "What is it?" "These past days, just being with you, getting to know you, it has felt like the most natural thing in the world. Levy said, his voice low and sincere. I know your husband's passing is still fresh, and I know we met under the worst circumstances imaginable. But I also know what I feel when I am with you, and it is something I have never felt before in my life. Emma felt tears welling up, but this time they were not tears of sorrow. I feel it too, she whispered, and it scares me, how fast and how strong it is. It scares me too, Levy admitted with a slight smile, but not enough to keep me from saying this. Whatever happens next, wherever we wind up, I want to be there with you. Not as some protector, but as a man who admires your courage more than anything and hopes he can earn your heart. Emma squeezed his hands, her own heart so full she could hardly breathe. You already have it, she told him plainly. My affection, my trust, my... She paused, the word love sitting right there on her tongue, but it still felt too big and new to say out loud. Levy seemed to understand completely. He gently raised one hand and cupped her face. May I? He asked, his eyes saying the rest. Emma just nodded. Levy leaned in and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was so tender it made every kiss before it seemed like a pale imitation. It was short, but it was filled with promise. It was a beginning. When they pulled apart, Emma was smiling, even with all the uncertainty that still hung over them. Whatever was coming down the road, she knew she would face it with this good man by her side. And for the first time in so many years, the future looked like it might hold some light instead of just shadows. They walked back to the cabin holding hands, a silent understanding now settled between them. Martha, who never missed a thing, saw the change in them right away. A little twinkle appeared in her eye as she served dinner, but she did not say a word, letting them have their private moment of happiness. Later that night, as Emma was getting ready for bed, there was a soft knock on her door. It was Martha holding a small folded bundle. Thought you might have a use for these, she said, setting the bundle on the small table. Some fresh clothes, a sewing kit, and a little ribbon for your hair. It is not much, but it is what I could spare. Thank you, Emma said, truly touched by the gesture. For everything. I do not know how we will ever be able to repay you and Ethan. Martha just waved a hand, dismissing the thought. Friends do not keep a tally, but there is something I wanted to talk to you about, just between us women. Yes? Emma asked, her curiosity piqued. Martha sat down at the table, motioning for Emma to do the same. I see what is happening between you and Levy, she said straight to the point, and I am glad for it. He is a good man who deserves some happiness, and so do you after all you have been through. Emma felt her cheeks grow warm. It has all happened so fast, she confessed. Sometimes I wonder if it is real, or just some reaction to everything. Martha's expression was full of wisdom. Sometimes, child, the heart knows what it wants long before the head is ready to admit it. Ethan and I were married 3 weeks after we first met. That was 20 years ago, and I have not regretted a single day. She paused, her face growing more serious. But there is something you ought to know about Levy, something that might help you understand the man he is. Did he ever tell you about his sister? Emma shook her head. He mentioned a half-sister, but that is all. Her name was Sarah, Martha said quietly. She was only 16 years old when their father killed their mother. After Levy ran away, Sarah was left all alone with that monster. By the time Levy was old enough and had enough money to go back for her, it was too late. Their father had beaten her to death in one of his drunken fits. Emma gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Oh, that is horrible. Poor Levy. It is why he did what he did when he saw your husband hurting you, Martha explained. It is why he could not just stand there and do nothing, even if it meant losing his own freedom. He has been carrying the guilt of not being able to save Sarah like a stone around his neck for a long, long time. Tears filled Emma's eyes as all the pieces of Levy's story clicked into place. His fierce need to protect her, his unwavering belief that helping her was worth any cost. Thank you for telling me, she said in a low voice. It helps me understand so much. Martha patted her hand. Just remember, when a man carries that kind of weight, sometimes he needs saving just as much as the people he is trying to protect. Levy is a strong man, but even the strongest oak needs something to lean on in a storm. With that, she stood up and left Emma alone with her thoughts. Sleep did not come easy that night. Emma's mind turned over everything she had just learned. Her heart ached for the little boy Levy had been, and for the man he became, carrying the impossible weight of his sister's memory. The next morning, Emma went looking for Levy and found him down by the creek that ran near the homestead. He was standing there skipping flat stones across the water, a thoughtful look on his face. "Do you mind if I join you?" she asked. He looked up at her, and his smile just warmed her right through. "I would like that very much." They sat down together on a big rock that overlooked the water. For a long while, they did not say anything, just enjoying the quiet in each other's company. Finally, it was Emma who spoke up. "Martha told me about your sister last night," she said softly. "She told me about Sarah." Levy's hand stopped in midair, and the stone he was about to throw just dropped to the ground. "Ah," was all he said. "I should have been the one to tell you." "You do not owe me any of your painful stories," Emma told him gently. "But I am glad that I know. It helps me understand why you did what you did, back in Concordia." Levy let out a long breath and stared out at the water. "I was too young back then, too weak to do anything to save my mother or Sarah. When I saw Thomas putting his hands on you, it was like watching it all happen again. Only this time I was not a helpless kid. This time I could do something about it." Emma reached out and took his hand, weaving her fingers in with his. "You did save me, Levy. You did not just save me from Thomas. You saved me from a life of being scared and hurt. No matter what happens from here on out, I will never, ever forget that." He gave her hand a squeeze, a simple gesture that said more than words ever could. They just sat there by the creek for a good long while. It felt like some of the weight from Levy's past had lifted just by sharing it, and the trust between them felt a whole lot stronger. That evening, when they all came together for supper, Ethan had some news. "A trader passed through while you two were out on your walk," he told them. "He brought some word from town." Levy went stiff as a board. "What kind of word?" "Well," Ethan said, "Sheriff Jenkins and his whole outfit rode back into Concordia about a week ago, with nothing to show for it. Seems that big storm washed out your tracks, and they figured you either drowned somewhere or lit out for parts unknown." Emma and Levy shared a look, a small wave of relief passing between them. "That sounds good," Levy said, "but it doesn't mean we are out of the woods yet." "There is more," Ethan went on. "The trader said there has been quite a commotion in Concordia since Jenkins got back. Seems a woman named Harriet, who worked with Emma at the saloon, has been telling anybody who'll listen what a brutal man Thomas Sullivan was and how he nearly killed Emma more than once." Emma's eyes grew wide. "Harriet? But she never opened her mouth when Thomas was alive. She saw the bruises, but she never said a word." "Folks find their courage at the strangest times," Martha remarked. "Maybe this is her way of making up for staying quiet before." The trader also mentioned that some of Thomas's card-playing buddies have had a falling out, Ethan added. "One of them, a fellow named Joe Miller, got deep in his cups and admitted they had all lied about what Thomas said on his last day. Said Thomas had been carrying on about killing Emma, not just going to talk to her." Levy leaned forward, his eyes burning with intensity. "Did the trader say how Sheriff Jenkins is taking all this?" Ethan shook his head. "No, but he did say the county judge is in Concordia now, and there is talk of a proper inquest into how Thomas died." This news gave them all something to chew on. If folks in Concordia were starting to see things differently, if the truth about Thomas was finally crawling into the light, then maybe, just maybe, Levy had a chance to clear his name. But it was a long shot, and the danger of going back was mighty big. "I need some time to think on this," Levy finally said, getting up from the table. "Thank you for the news, Ethan." He stepped outside into the cool night air, and after a second, Emma followed him. She found him standing in the yard, just staring up at the endless blanket of stars. "What is on your mind?" she asked gently. "That we might have a chance to stop all this running," he answered. "If this judge is a fair man, and if enough people tell the truth about Thomas, if what Joe Miller said holds up, that is a whole lot of ifs, but it might just be a chance worth taking." Emma came and stood right beside him. "It is your call to make," she said. "Whatever you decide, I am with you." Levy turned to her, his face serious in the pale light. "No, Emma, it is our call. What happens to me happens to you now. Just like what happens to you happens to me. That is what it means when you care about someone the way I care about you." Her heart filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer air. All right then, she said. Let us figure it out together. What is the risk if we go back? If that judge does not believe our side of the story, I could hang for murder, Levy said, not mincing words, and you could face charges for helping me. At the very least, we would have to live through all the ugly talk and scandal. Emma nodded, thinking it over. And if we do not go back, if we just keep running? We could start over, he said, somewhere far away from Kansas, maybe California or even Oregon. We could build new lives with new names, but we would always be looking over our shoulders, always wondering if our past was going to catch up. They stood there in silence for a spell, weighing it all. Finally, Emma spoke up. I think we should go back, she said, her voice steady. Face whatever is waiting for us in Concordia. Not right this second, but soon. Levy looked at her face, lit by the moonlight. Why? Because running is just another word for living in fear, and I have had a lifetime's worth of that, Emma answered plainly. And because I believe in you, I believe in us, I believe in the truth of what happened. If there is even a small chance we can get our lives back, we have to take it. Our lives in your ranch, it is a risk worth taking. A slow grin stretched across Levy's face. You are a remarkable woman, Emma Sullivan. More courageous than you give yourself credit for. Not courageous, she corrected him. Just done letting fear decide my path for me. Levy reached out and pulled her into his arms, and Emma settled in without hesitation, resting her head against his chest. She could hear the steady rhythm of his heart and feel the strength in his hold. It was nothing like the controlling grip Thomas had used to keep her down, but a gentle embrace that offered support while honoring her freedom. Whatever comes next, Levy whispered into her hair, we will face it together. Together, Emma repeated. The word was both a promise and a prayer. They went back to the cabin to tell the Millers about their decision. Ethan and Martha were worried, of course, but they respected their choice. We are going to have to be smart about this, Ethan warned. Send a message ahead to see how things are. We need to make sure it is safe for you to go back. I know a fella in Salina who can help with that, Levy said. He does business in Concordia from time to time and would not raise any suspicion. I can get a letter to him tomorrow. Then that settles it, Ethan said with a nod. You will stay put right here until we hear something back. In the meantime, that barn roof is not going to finish itself, and Martha has a list of chores for you as long as a country mile. The familiar teasing eased the tension in the room, and the evening closed with a feeling of careful hope. As Emma got ready for bed that night, she found herself looking toward the future with a sense of promise she had not felt in many long years. The days that followed settled into a comfortable routine. Levy wrote his letter to his friend in Salina, and Ethan found a passing trader to deliver it for them. While they waited for a reply, life on the homestead went on with hard work during the day and quiet evenings spent together. For the first time in forever, Emma slept through the night, free from the grip of fear. Emma and Levy's bond grew stronger during that time of waiting. They talked about their hopes for the future, a little shyly at first, but then with more and more certainty. Emma learned all about Silver Creek Ranch and the life Levy had carved out for himself there. Levy, in turn, came to understand the dreams Emma had been forced to put away during her years with Thomas. She had once thought of teaching, like her father had, or maybe even running a small shop of her own. No matter what happens in Concordia, Levy told her one evening as they strolled by the stream, I want you to know you have choices. If you want to teach, or open a store, or do anything else, I will stand right there with you. Even if it means we would have to live in different places, Emma asked, gently testing how far his support went. Levy thought about her question for a moment. I would much rather be wherever you are, he admitted. But I meant every word I said about choices. Your happiness is what matters to me, Emma. If I have to change my own plans to make that happen, then that is exactly what I will do. His answer was all the proof Emma needed. It confirmed what she had already started to believe deep down, that Levy's love, unlike the love Thomas claimed to have, was not about owning her, but about setting her free. It gave her strength instead of taking it away. 2 weeks after they sent the letter, a reply finally came. Ethan rode back from town with it, his face giving nothing away as he handed the sealed envelope to Levy. They all gathered around the table while Levy broke the wax seal and began to read it out loud. Levy, things have changed quite a bit in Concordia since you left. The official inquiry into Thomas Sullivan's death is over, and they have ruled it justifiable homicide. Your actions were considered self-defense and defense of another person. Judge Matt specifically mentioned the proof of Sullivan's long history of violence and the words of several witnesses who saw him attack his wife. Sheriff Jenkins is not happy about the ruling, but he has been ordered to drop every charge against you and Mrs. Sullivan. There is some talk around town that his job might be on the line because of how he handled this whole mess and some other things. Your foreman, Jake, has kept Silver Creek Ranch running just fine while you have been gone. The ranch is doing well, though everyone certainly misses having you around. It ought to be safe for you to come back whenever you are ready. I would suggest you travel out in the open instead of trying to sneak back. Your innocence is now a matter of record, and skulking around might send the wrong message. Your friend, Howard. A heavy silence hung in the air after Levy finished reading. Then Martha let out a whoop of pure joy that made them all jump. "Well, praise be," she shouted. "Did I not tell you that justice would find its way?" Ethan was quieter, but just as happy. That is mighty good news. It just goes to show you the truth has a way of coming to light, even in a town like Concordia. Emma felt as if a giant weight had been lifted right off her shoulders, a burden she had carried for so long she had almost forgotten it was there. "We can go home," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "We are free." Levy folded the letter with care, a mix of relief and deep thought on his face. "It sure seems that way," he agreed. "Though I reckon there will still be some folks in town who give us the side eye." "Let them look," Emma said, her voice ringing with a confidence she had not known she had. "We know the truth, and it looks like the law knows it now, too." Levy's eyes met hers, and they were filled with warmth, admiration, and something much deeper. "When do you want to head out?" "Soon," Emma answered, "but not right away. I would like a few more days here to get ourselves ready and to thank Ethan and Martha the right way for everything they have done for us." And so it was settled. They would leave in 3 days, taking the main road back to Kansas instead of the hidden trails they had used to escape. Ethan offered to ride with them all the way to the Colorado border, just to make sure they got through the mountain passes safely. The next few days were a flurry of activity, packing food for the long journey, mending their clothes, and writing letters to send ahead to Jake at Silver Creek Ranch. But in between all the practical chores, Emma found quiet moments to think. On their last evening at the Miller homestead, after the dinner plates were cleared away and the children were tucked into bed, Levy asked if he could speak with Emma alone. Simone. They walked to their favorite spot down by the stream, where the view of the mountains was truly breathtaking in the fading light. "Emma," Levy started, once they were sitting on their usual rock, "before we head back to Kansas, there is something very important I need to ask you." The seriousness in his voice made Emma's heart beat a little faster. "Yes?" Levy took both of her hands in his gaze steady and fixed on hers. "These past few weeks have been the strangest of my entire life. They have been dangerous and uncertain and full of hardship. But they have also been the very best, because I have spent them with you, getting to know you, seeing your strength, your kindness, your courage, and falling in love with you." Emma's breath caught in her throat at his words. Even though they had become so close, and their feelings were plain to see in every look and touch, neither of them had actually said the word love out loud until that very moment. "I love you too," she whispered, and the words felt both incredibly huge and perfectly natural. "More than I ever thought I could." A brilliant smile lit up Levy's face. "Then I have to ask you, when we get back to Kansas and life finally finds its way back to something normal, would you consider becoming my wife?" Even though she had been half expecting the question, hearing him say it sent a shiver of pure happiness right through her. She thought for a second about her first marriage, a decision she had made out of fear and a desperate need for safety, which had only brought her pain. This felt so completely different. It was a choice she was making from a place of strength, not weakness, a choice born from love, not from need. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and sure. "Yes, I would be honored to be your wife, Levy Kincaid." He pulled her into a deep hug, and their kiss was more passionate and full of promise than the gentle one they had shared days before. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing a little fast, their eyes shining with joy. "I do not have a ring for you just yet," Levy said, almost apologizing. "But as soon as we get to Silver Creek, I do not need a ring, Emma cut in. All I need is your love and your respect. Everything else is just details. They walked back to the cabin, hand in hand, ready to tell the Millers their good news. The Millers were overjoyed for them and declared, late as it was, that they had to celebrate. Martha brought out a bottle of blackberry wine she'd been keeping for just such a time, and they all raised a glass to the happy couple with warm wishes and laughter. Emma smiled and said, "Now you'll have to come back for the wedding, both of you, and bring the children." Ethan grinned right back at her. "You just try and keep us away. It has been far too long since I had a good reason to dust off my Sunday suit." The trip home to Kansas felt a world away from their desperate escape to Colorado. This time, they rode on the main roads right out in the open, stayed in proper inns, and talked freely with the folks they met along the way. It was a comfort to see that nobody gave them a second glance or seemed to care about their business. At the Colorado line, they said their goodbyes to Ethan, promising they would all visit back and forth. Then Emma and Levy rode eastward by themselves. Their horses kept a relaxed pace and their hearts felt light, even with the unknowns still waiting for them back in Concordia. When they crossed into Kansas, Emma was filled with a powerful mix of feelings. This was the land where she had known so much pain. But it was also the place where she had found a love and a freedom she never expected. The familiar rolling prairie that once felt like a cage now looked like the perfect place for a brand new start. They finally reached Silver Creek Ranch on a golden afternoon in the early fall. As they rode up the long drive, Emma saw the same building she had run from just weeks before. Only now they did not mean danger. They meant hope. This place could be her home, not just a hideout, but a real home where she could build a life. Jake was the first one to see them. He dropped the fence post he was fixing and came running toward them, letting out a joyful holler. "Boss!" he yelled out. "You're back!" The other ranch hands started gathering around, their faces lighting up in wide smiles when they saw their employer. Levy swung down from his horse and was right away surrounded by men, all eager to shake his hand and welcome him back. Emma watched it all, her heart feeling full to bursting. The way these men stood by Levy told her everything she needed to know about his character, about the kind of good man she had just promised to marry. Mrs. Abernathy came out of the main house, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face, which was usually set in a stern line, had softened with pure relief. "It is about time you two came home," she said, her voice a little rough, though her eyes were shining with tears she would not let fall. "This place just has not been the same without you." "It is good to be back," Levy said simply. He then turned and put an arm around Emma, bringing her into the moment. He said, "Mrs. Abernathy, I do believe you remember Miss Emma Sullivan." The housekeeper gave a firm nod. "Of course, welcome back, Miss Emma." Levy's voice rang out for all to hear. "Soon to be Mrs. Kincaid." The announcement was met with a round of cheers and some friendly joking from the ranch hands. Mrs. Abernathy's eyebrows shot up, but a look of approval settled on her face. "Well now," she said, "that is the kind of news that calls for a celebration. I expect you'll be wanting your room made ready, Miss Emma, and maybe a hot bath after such a long ride." "That would be just wonderful, thank you," Emma answered with a grateful smile. As Mrs. Abernathy guided her toward the house, Emma looked back over her shoulder and met Levy's gaze. He was standing there with his men, listening as Jake filled him in on what had happened at the ranch while he was gone. But his eyes were locked on her, full of warmth and love, and the promise of the future they were going to build right here together. The next few weeks were a busy time of settling in and making plans. Levy took back the reins of running the ranch, and Emma began learning the daily rhythms of life there. Mrs. Abernathy turned out to be a godsend, showing Emma how the household was run without once making her feel foolish for not knowing. Their first trip into Concordia was a nerve-wracking day. They rode in together on a busy market day, picking a time on purpose when the streets would be crowded with people. Just as they figured, their arrival caused quite a stir. Talk would stop cold in the middle of a sentence. Heads turned to watch them ride by. A trail of whispers followed them down the street. But there were friendly faces in the crowd, too. Harriet from the saloon came rushing over and threw her arms around Emma, her eyes filled with tears. "I am so very sorry I never said anything before," she whispered. "I was just so scared. But that is no excuse." "It is all right," Emma told her gently. "The important thing is you spoke up when it counted the most." A few other townsfolk came up to them, some wanting to show their support, and others just wanting a closer look. Sheriff Jenkins was nowhere to be seen, and they heard later that he had skipped town not long after the inquest, his good name ruined. Heron, the saloon owner, even offered Emma her old job back with more pay, and he seemed truly shocked when she turned him down. "I have other plans for my future now," she told him politely. They stopped at the general store, the bank, and a few other places they needed to for the ranch's business. Everywhere they went, people reacted differently. Some were welcoming, others were cautious, but nobody was openly unkind. It was, Emma thought, about the best they could have hoped for. As they rode back to Silver Creek that evening, Emma felt like a heavy chapter of her life had finally closed. Concordia would never feel like a comfortable town for her, holding too many painful memories, but it did not have a hold on her anymore. She had faced down the town and discovered she was stronger than any of its gossip or judgment. Their wedding was a simple one, held right there at Silver Creek Ranch on a clear, crisp day in October. The Millers came all the way from Colorado, just like they promised, bringing their children in a beautiful quilt they had made by hand as a wedding gift. Jake stood beside Levy as his best man, and Martha stood up with Emma. The minister from the small church that served the nearby ranches performed the ceremony. Emma wore a new dress of deep blue silk that Levy had bought for her, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers she had picked from the prairie that very morning. Levy, dressed in a new suit that made him look handsome but a little bit stiff, could not take his eyes off her as she walked toward him. The vows they spoke were the old, traditional words, but for them, everyone was filled with a deep and personal meaning. When Emma promised to love, honor, and cherish, she said it as a woman who was making her own free choice, not as someone who had run out of choices. And when Levy promised to protect and provide, he said it as a true partner, not as a master. The party afterward was a happy affair with good food and music. A couple of the ranch hands played a fiddle and a harmonica, and the dancing went on long into the night. Emma found herself being passed from one dance partner to the next as all the men of Silver Creek made sure to welcome their boss's new wife into their big ranch family. But the moment she would always remember most clearly happened late that evening. She and Levy slipped away from the party for a quiet minute to stand out under the endless, star-filled sky. "Are you happy, Mrs. Kincaid?" Levy asked, his arms wrapped around her waist. "I am happier than I ever dreamed I could be," Emma said, and she meant every word. "And you? Do you have any regrets about asking that dark-eyed waitress if she wanted a way out?" Levy's laugh was warm against the cool night air. "My only regret is that I did not ask you sooner," he said. He then bent down and kissed her with a gentleness that still made her heart skip a beat. The years went by, and Silver Creek Ranch thrived under their care. Emma found her own place there, not just as Levy's wife, but as his partner in running the place. She had a sharp mind for numbers and details, which proved to be a huge help with the ranch's finances. When a small school was started for the children of the ranch hands and other nearby families, Emma finally got to live her dream of being a teacher, sharing her father's love of books and learning with a whole new generation. Levy grew the ranch, buying more land, investing in better cattle, and trying out new ways of farming. His name became known all around as a fair boss and an honest man, which only made the ranch more successful. Their first child, a son they named Ethan Thomas Kincaid, was born in the spring of their second year together. He was followed 2 years later by a daughter, Sarah Martha, named after Levy's sister and their good friend from Colorado. Both of their children grew up strong and healthy, with all the love in the world and the wide-open Kansas prairie as their backyard. The past was never completely forgotten. The scars from what Thomas had done, the danger they had been in, the desperate escape to Colorado, all of it had shaped who they were. But those things did not define them anymore. They were just early chapters in a much longer and happier story. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Levy gave Emma a surprise gift. It was the deed to a small building in Concordia. It used to be a hat shop, but it had been sitting empty for years. "What is this for?" Emma asked, completely puzzled. "It is for your dream," Levy told her. "You told me once that you had thought about owning a business of your own. I figured maybe a bookshop, since you love to read so much. Or it can be whatever you want it to be." Emma just stared at the paper in her hands, touched so deeply by how thoughtful he was. But in Concordia? Are you sure? I am sure, Levy said, his voice firm. That town holds some bad memories, I know, but it is also the place where I first met you. It is where our story began. Maybe it is time we made some good memories there, on our own terms. And so, along with her teaching and her duties at the ranch, Emma opened Concordia's very first real bookstore, ordering books from places as far away as New York and San Francisco. The little shop became a gathering spot for folks who were hungry for knowledge and new stories, a small spark of culture on the Kansas frontier. Life was not always simple. There were droughts that threatened the herd, and blizzards that put the cattle in danger, and money worries when the price of beef dropped. There were disagreements between the husband and wife, as there always are when two strong-willed people build a life together. There were still nights when Emma would wake up from nightmares of Thomas's hands on her throat, and Levy would just hold her close until the fear went away. But through it all, they met every single challenge side by side, with the kind of strength that only comes from a true partnership and a deep, abiding love. They built a life that neither one of them could have ever dreamed of that day, back in Harlan's saloon, when a bruised waitress looked up and met the eyes of a kind-hearted cowboy. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch of their bigger ranch house, watching their children play in the yard, Emma thought about the long road that had brought them to that very moment. 10 years ago, she said softly, I did not think there was any way out. I truly thought that life, waiting tables, putting up with Thomas's fists, just getting through one day to the next, was all there would ever be for me. Levy took her hand in his, and his touch was as comforting and familiar as it was exciting. And now Emma smiled, her eyes on their children, on the thriving ranch, and on the man sitting next to her who had offered her a hand without asking for anything back. Now I know that there is always a way out, if you are just brave enough to take that first step. And I know that sometimes the end of one story is really just the beginning of a much better one. Levy leaned over and kissed her, a gesture that still held all the tenderness of their very first kiss. Here is to our better story, he murmured, and to all the chapters we still have left to write. As the sun dipped below the horizon of Silver Creek Ranch, painting the sky with colors no artist could ever hope to capture, Emma Kincaid gave a silent prayer of thanks for that awful day when a cowboy had noticed her black eye and asked, just one time, if she wanted out. That one simple question had changed her entire world.